We struggle not against persons and principalities, but the dark powers of this world, ladies and gentlemen, the dark powers of this world, which have many persons and principalities in its grips. But we must first understand what those dark powers are before we can fight those persons and principalities that are nodes of power from the central nexus of evil and civilizational collapse. And that's what I want to talk about today, the sort of underlying tensions and deteriorating conditions which preceded stats like this. This is from We Think Polling. Now, polling has two roles. It either registers public opinion or it actively shapes public opinion. And I think given this company has existed since 2002, they have diversity and inclusion targets that they hit every year, they're a left-wing polling company, as are pretty much all polling companies except Matt Goodwin's. And so this is not to shape public opinion, but rather to register the fact that about a third to 40% of people in the UK think that violence is sometimes the only means that citizens have to get the attention of politicians when it comes to the refugee problem. So complaints about mass migration and illegal migration have become such a fault line in public salience. So many people are being directly affected because the Home Office is buying up dispersed accommodation, private housing, driving up the cost of housing, packing local hotels with men from the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa who mill about in their town centres at our expense and have cultural prejudices against our mothers, daughters, wives, children, our entire civilization. It's so observable that now 36% of people say that, quote-unquote, xenophobic acts of violence, we don't know how the question was framed, but even if that was included in there, that's massive, are defensible if they result in fewer refugees being settled in your town. Now, again, I don't advise anyone commit an act of violence. Don't give the government any excuse to lock you up because they already want to persecute you for otherwise sensible opinions about the scale and unassimilable quality of migration, legal and illegal alike in Britain. But the fact that it's reached this point where 30 to 40% of people in the country are saying, I will commit acts of violence in order to get the government to listen, it shows how far things have come. And I want to look at some of the reasons we've got here. But let's look at the perception of the riots overall. Just to build your defenses against the narrative that this is all just far-right thuggery with no legitimate basis for the grievances, something that Yvette Cooper has said, that a Guardian piece that came out yesterday say that there is no legitimate complaints about migration. Well, YouGov, which are very much a company focused on shaping public perception rather than registering it. Remember, Nadim Zahawi was the vaccine minister, also founded and was involved in YouGov at the time of the COVID lockdowns, where 71% of people consistently polled were responding positively to every tyrannical measure that the UK government had floated or enforced, whether that be vaccine passports, potential vaccine mandates, further lockdowns, social distancing, masking, censoring dissident voices, monitoring them with the 77th Brigade. All of these various measures that were polled and put to people that were acts by Zahawi's own government registered positively by YouGov. So they're manufacturing consent. The reason I brought this up is because they did a large amount of polling on the riots, and public perception about the riots is fascinating. So take YouGov's numbers with a pillar of salt here, but it should be instructive as to political responses to whether or not the rioters and the protesters, two different groups, grievances are legitimate, and how certain politicians should be responding to this. So, 85% of Britons overall opposed the unrest at recent protests. Just 7% say they support the violence. So, a smaller number than that prior We Think polling survey. Even the broader protests hold the support of 1 in 3 Britons, 34%, with more than half, 54%, opposed. Just 12% of Britons think that the recent disorder is justified, compared to 82% who think it is unjustified. Though note, the people who think that there are legitimate underlying grievances are about a third of the country, and remember the very small vote share, I think it was about 30-odd% of the vote, that Keir Starmer needed to get of a historical low voter turnout in order to win a landslide majority. So there is a large constituency here who feel that politics isn't representing their interests, that the ballot box is not the way to do things, that they need to take to the streets and commit violence, get their concerns heard. Again, don't do that. But those people are doing so because they feel they have no representation, and so they are ripe for being represented. And someone should be courageous enough to step forwards. This is what I meant 2 podcasts ago now when I said a Bukele figure or a Bardella figure provides a way for people to exercise their discontent via democratic means. And so if you're concerned about democracy and you want to vote your way out of this, again, not advising violence, it's criminal. If you do want that to be the solution, then a politician needs to be brave enough to step forward for it. I'm not saying that voting will be the fix-all. I am saying that there is space here for a politician who is courageous enough to do the right thing to capture an otherwise disenfranchised voter base. Just 12% of Britons think the recent disorder is justified, compared to 82% who think it is unjustified. That's regarding the violence. 19% of Britons think the police should be allowed to use firearms and live ammunition in the course of dealing with rioters. Now, that sounds dispiriting, but what that is are rich boomers in the heartlands who have a reflexive reaction to any time there is civil unrest. This could be the Leicester riots of 2022. This could be the London riots of 2011. It doesn't matter the cause. They just see people smashing up shops and fighting in the streets and think, send the army in and shoot anyone. That is their opinion. You're always going to get that. I think that rather than trying to eradicate that sense of people clinging to a security state, which people always will, this is where the sort of libertarian anarchist argument falls flat. It's people will, there's a subset of people who will seek the strongest man in the room to fall in line behind. We saw this during COVID lockdowns. People just want to be told what to do because it's safe and secure, provides them some predictability in life, rather than trying to create a political movement that is in opposition to that natural instinct. Harness it and understand it, because people will gravitate to the strongest possible man who's providing a sensible take on why this thing is happening and some sensible and reasonable solutions to prevent it in future, such as deporting all foreign criminals. 62% of Britons would support bringing in the army to help tackle the 2024 riots. Reform UK voters are the only group showing any substantive level of support at 21%. Even this is a clear minority, with 3/4 of Reform voters, 76%, opposed to the riots. Support among other voters is far lower. Only 9% of Conservatives, 3% of Labour voters, and 1% of Lib Dems favour the outbreak and violent disorder, because they support all of the policies that have led to these riots. Reform UK voters are the only voting group in the wider protest to support the wider protests and unrest that it is stemming from, with 8 in 10, 81%, saying they support the protests to some degree. That means the underlying justification for the protests is legitimate, even if the violence and criminal activity is not. Fewer than 1 in 5 Labour or Lib Dem voters, so that's 18 to 19%, support the protests, while Conservatives are split on the matter. 43% support, 48% oppose. 18 to 19% of Lib Dem and Labour voters support the idea that the protests are being waged because foreign criminals are breaking into the country, that Islam is being given financial and legal preferential treatment over the native population, and that we shouldn't be importing migrant criminals. Sorry. 18 to 19% of Labour and Lib Dem voters believe that's the case and are still voting Labour and Lib Dem. What are you doing? I mean, for some people, it really is as tribal as a football team, and you'll never get to shake it, no matter how much the politicians mistreat their voter base. It really is a sort of battered wife-style Stockholm syndrome. But, again, in the Labour heartlands, where reform came second, there is a prime opportunity to represent the concerns of the people who believe that those causing criminal damage are wrong to do so, but that are animated by legitimate concerns. Sympathies with the views of those taking part in the protests are broader. 6 in 10 Britons, 58%, say they have a great deal or fair amount of sympathy for the views of those peacefully taking part in demonstrations that were ostensibly triggered by the Southport murders. This includes majorities of Labour and Lib Dem voters, 53 to 56%, as well as 2/3 of Conservatives, 64%, and Reform voters at 83%. This is why Keir Starmer engaged in the most unforced optics blunder by saying, 1, it doesn't matter about what the cause of the people out at protests were, and made no distinctions between the protests and the riots. He lumped everyone in as far-right thugs, indiscriminately targeting Muslims and brown people, which was not the case. He was recalcitrant to acknowledge the mass Muslim mobs rampaging on British streets, intimidating Sky News journalists, slashing tyres, lacerating the liver of pubgoers, spreading fake news, as Nick Lowles did of Hope Not Hate, about acid attacks on Muslim women, which never happened. And what he's done there is estranged a portion of his voter base who saw him as a safe pair of hands, in contrast to the chaos, economic mismanagement, and poor moral conduct of the Conservative Party. So people that thought that Keir Starmer might be a moderate, who have sympathised with the grieving families of Southport, a community ravaged by a senseless act of violence perpetrated by a second-generation immigrant who is not a native Welshman, and people who are concerned about levels of migration and lack of integration and the economic and cultural costs of that immigration, Keir Starmer's alienated all of them. They're now up for grabs, as are the sofa voters that we covered previously in that report from Policy Exchange. There are lots of disenfranchised people, there's a lot of free-floating anxiety, and that has struck this incident like a lightning rod. Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.